There is a climactic moment approaching when being situated in the wrong location will determine the critical difference between survival and sudden death. Jesus unveiled 4 highly specific places, 4 zones of immediate peril, where you must never find yourself when the Great Tribulation ignites. These locations appear commonplace, even mundane today, but they are destined to become fatal, inescapable traps for anyone caught within their boundaries. The 4th place, the one that carries the most chilling weight, is intrinsically connected to Daniel's most terrifying prophetic vision. An abomination, an act of sacrilege so horrific and vile that it will inevitably trigger the single worst, most compressed period of suffering in all of human history. Jesus declared, "This generation will not vanish from the earth until every single one of these things has reached its fulfillment." The signs are already shifting and aligning themselves for the final pattern. The profound question is no longer merely if this catastrophic time will occur, but whether you will unlock the hidden knowledge of these forbidden places before the door of opportunity slams shut forever. Jesus stepped deliberately away from the colossal, glittering magnificence of the temple in Jerusalem, moving slowly down the hot, dusty street. His disciples walked close beside him, feeling the scorching midday sun beating relentlessly against the brilliant white of their tunics, while the heavy, sweet scent of sacred frankincense still clung tenaciously to the dry, motionless air. Behind them, the sheer walls of Herod's massive temple complex towered into the blue sky. Each enormous block of stone, weighing multiple tons, was fitted together with such astonishing precision, completely without mortar, creating a monumental display of architectural genius that had required nearly 50 years of labor to achieve. The disciples could still faintly distinguish the distant, rhythmic chanting of priests echoing from within the impenetrable sacred walls, the sound blurring slightly with the general, chaotic din of the heavily crowded streets below. The disciples instinctively turned back, pointing toward the immense, polished stones of the temple facade, which gleamed almost painfully under the high sun. They stood rooted in place, admiring the sheer, grandiose scale of the structure, with its golden towers reflecting the blinding, harsh light, the sound of the ancient prayers drifting faintly through the cold stone mass. Try to grasp the sheer scope of what arrested their attention. These were not merely large building stones. Some of these colossal limestone blocks measured a staggering 40 feet long, 12 feet high, and 18 feet wide. The entire temple complex consumed a dizzying 35 acres. The exterior walls soared 150 feet high into the heavens. This structure stood as one of the undisputed architectural wonders of the entire ancient world, a monumental testament to both fervent divine worship and peak human engineering achievement, a project that had been ceaselessly under construction for almost 5 decades. "Master," one of them finally uttered, his voice heavy with genuine awe and reverence. "Look at these magnificent stones. Just look at these breathtaking buildings." They gestured toward the gleaming, pure white limestone that seemed to catch the sunlight like freshly polished, expensive marble. The temple's sprawling facade was entirely covered in intricate gold plating that caused the structure to radiate light, making it shine like an oppressive second sun. Josephus, the Jewish historian, would later write that, when viewed from a distance, the temple appeared like a snow-covered mountain, an illusion created by the contrast between its brilliantly white stones and its heavy gold covering. Jesus stopped abruptly in the busy thoroughfare, turned, and fixed them with a gaze that was instantly penetrating, declaring in a voice that was firm and utterly devoid of doubt, "Do you truly see all these incredible things? I tell you the truth. Not a single stone here will be allowed to remain upon another. Every single one will be violently thrown down." He felt a light, dry breeze stir the folds of his garment while his disciples froze instantly in silent, stunned shock. Internalize that statement again. Not one stone would be left standing upon another. Every single block, every fitted piece would be demolished and scattered. Contemplate the seismic implications of these words for them. They had just been marveling at stones so unimaginably massive that their removal seemed physically impossible. These were blocks that demanded hundreds of laborers and the most sophisticated engineering of the time just to hoist into position. The temple embodied not just religious devotion, but the absolute permanence of their faith, the continuity of their nation, and the eternal validity of their entire way of life. And Jesus had just delivered the definitive sentence of its total catastrophic destruction. They resumed their walk, heading toward the sacred slopes of the Mount of Olives, climbing the steep, rugged incline covered with ancient olive trees whose silver-green leaves shivered and swayed restlessly in the wind, the rocky ground crunching loudly beneath their worn leather sandals. The winding path took them upward through groves that had stood there for countless generations, their gnarled, twisted trunks contorted by the relentless force of time and harsh weather. The disciples walked in a deep, stunned silence, their minds reeling as they tried to process the incomprehensible thing they had just heard. How could something so magnificent, so seemingly eternal and permanent, ever be reduced to nothing but scattered rubble? Jesus finally settled onto a large, flat stone near the summit of the mount, looking down across the valley at the distant temple, which still shone vividly like pure gold in the lingering daylight, feeling the rough, unyielding texture of the rock against his palms, while the fresh, clean mountain air expanded in his lungs. From this elevated vantage point, the entire temple complex was spread out below them, detailed like a perfectly crafted miniature city. The late afternoon sun struck the gold-covered walls and sent brilliant, frantic reflections dancing across the dark expanse of the Kidron Valley. The sight was undeniably breathtaking, a beauty that made Jesus' chilling prophecy even more shocking and paradoxical. The disciples quietly approached him, gathering privately. Peter, James, John, and Andrew positioned themselves at the front, kneeling on the dry, uneven grass, the sound of tiny birds chirping softly around them while the descending sun tinged the western sky with deep reddish-orange tones. They could feel the immediate cool evening air beginning to flow down from the higher elevations, carrying with it the sharp, clean scent of wild herbs and arid earth. The remaining disciples formed a tight semicircle around their master, their faces etched with a mixture of intense concern and burning curiosity. They asked him anxiously, their voices hushed and urgently low, "Tell us, when exactly will these things occur? And what precisely will be the sign that indicates your coming and the sign that marks the end of the age?" They nervously touched one another's hands, feeling the distinct chill of the approaching night wind. Matthew 24 verse 3 records their exact phrasing. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, "Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" Notice that they posed three distinct, interlocking questions. When would the temple be leveled? What visible phenomenon would be the sign of Jesus' return? And what physical signal would announce the culmination, the final end of the age? These were not abstract, theoretical theological debates. These were men desperately seeking tangible, practical information about events that would definitively and violently reshape their entire known world. Jesus leaned forward slightly, his expression grave and serious, fixing his gaze upon each man one by one, and began to answer them with a solemn, profound tone, the sound of his voice echoing subtly against the surrounding hard rocks while the twilight deepened the distant horizon into an inky mass. The overwhelming weight of the future secrets he was about to reveal pressed down on that specific moment, heavy and immovable as a dense stone. These were not merely vague predictions about events lying centuries in the future. A significant portion of what he was about to disclose would happen within their own lifetimes. He first issued a potent warning about inevitable future deceptions, gesturing slowly with his calloused hands. "Be vigilant that no one leads you astray or deceives you." He felt the cooling night air caress his exposed skin, while the disciples urgently leaned their heads forward to listen with absolute attention. This was far from casual advice. This was an urgent life-and-death warning about the single most dangerous, insidious threat they would ever confront, the danger of being led disastrously astray by convincing, sophisticated lies. Jesus continued, describing the wave of false messiahs who would inevitably arise, pointing a finger toward the dark, unseen valley below. "For many will come asserting my authority, falsely claiming, 'I am the Messiah,' and they will, tragically, deceive a great multitude." The sharp, distant call of a crow momentarily shattered the tense silence. Pause and consider that statement. Many, not just a few isolated crackpots, but many would arrive claiming to be the Christ. And they would not just make the claim, they would be skilled enough to mislead countless people. This deception would be neither clumsy nor immediately obvious. These false messiahs would possess enough charisma and perform enough convincing wonders to sweep entire multitudes away into error. They would perform astounding signs and wonders. They would speak with an air of absolute authority. They would loudly claim to possess direct divine backing. And in those inevitable times of overwhelming crisis and deep uncertainty, desperate, vulnerable people would instantly believe them. The disciples nodded slowly, feeling a visceral chill snake down their spines as they imagined vast populations being utterly deceived. Jesus continued, his voice gaining intensity, the wind beginning to stir faintly the leaves of the nearby olive trees. The darkness was rapidly settling in around their small circle, and the temperature was dropping quickly. They instinctively pulled their heavy cloaks tighter as Jesus' words painted an increasingly troubling, ominous picture of the future. These false messiahs would not simply appear, quietly fail and disappear. They would successfully gather dedicated followers. They would build powerful movements. Entire populations would be swept along by the audacity and certainty of their claims. Envision the scenario this created. In times of profound crisis, when people are deeply desperate and paralyzingly afraid, they become supremely vulnerable to anyone offering a semblance of hope and certainty. These skilled deceivers would exploit that naked desperation. They would promise immediate deliverance, claim indisputable divine authority, and perform highly convincing signs. And many, a multitude, not just a scattered few, would tragically accept their lies. He then spoke of coming global conflicts, raising his voice slightly, and you will constantly hear reports of wars and persistent rumors of wars. Make certain that you are not alarmed or terrified, for this historical process must indeed take place, but understand clearly that the end is not yet here. Jesus reached out and firmly touched Peter's arm to emphasize the gravity of the point. Note his exact phrasing. They would hear of wars and persistent rumors of wars. They wouldn't necessarily witness them firsthand, but they would receive constant reports from distant, foreign places. Consider the implications of this. It suggests a level of communication and media transmission that would successfully spread news of global conflicts far beyond their immediate regional world. Wars would become a constant, inescapable backdrop to the human experience. Not merely occasional skirmishes between neighboring tribes or cities, but a persistent, unrelenting state of warfare perpetually raging somewhere in the world. The rumors of war would be just as psychologically disturbing as the actual battles. Reports of vast armies gathering, of volatile alliances forming, of aggressive threats being hurled. The very air around humanity would be thick with tension and the constant, unnerving possibility of violence. Jesus then described the widespread uprising of nations, gesturing broadly toward the rapidly darkening sky. For nation will rise up violently against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. He felt the night's humidity beginning to settle heavily in the air around them. This was far from mere local conflict he was describing. This was global instability on a scale that they had never been able to conceptualize. Nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom. Not just simple border skirmishes or internal dynastic disputes, but widespread, international warfare that would fundamentally reshape the entire map of the known world. The disciples sat in stunned silence, their minds straining to grasp the immense scope of the cataclysm Jesus was describing. They were currently living in a time when the powerful Roman Empire had imposed a relative peace, the Pax Romana, across much of the Mediterranean world. The very idea of widespread, continuous warfare between nations seemed almost utterly unthinkable. Yet Jesus spoke with the certainty of someone calmly describing events that had already irrevocably happened. He next mentioned the coming famines and earthquakes with a clear prophetic tone. And there will be widespread famines and catastrophic pestilences and devastating earthquakes in various places across the globe. The disciples instinctively felt the solid ground beneath them, as if it already trembled slightly in terrified anticipation. Matthew 24 verses 7-8 records his precise words. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Read that last phrase again. the beginning of sorrows. These catastrophic events, the wars, the crushing famines, the spreading plagues, the violent earthquakes, were not the final end itself. They were merely the terrifying beginning. Like the severe birth pangs that signal the immediate onset of labor, these massive disasters would only mark the start of something infinitely greater and more terrifying. Ponder the immense suffering Jesus was describing. Famines that would sweep ruthlessly across entire regions, leaving millions starving to death. Earthquakes that would level vast cities and permanently reshape coastlines. Pestilences, plagues, that would spread rapidly from nation to nation, killing indiscriminately without any regard for wealth or social status. And all of this horror happening not in one isolated location, but simultaneously in diverse places around the world. Jesus continued, issuing a sharp warning about inevitable persecutions, looking directly into John's eyes. Then they will deliver you up to intense tribulation and will put you to death, and you will become fundamentally hated by all nations for the singular sake of my name. The sound of his voice, heavy and resonant with urgency, echoed clearly in the mountain stillness. This was not some distant, theoretical threat he was outlining. This was their own intensely personal, horrific future. They would be hunted, captured, tortured, and eventually murdered, not just by local nervous authorities, but by a coordinated hatred from all nations. Imagine the crushing weight of hearing those exact words. These men had abandoned absolutely everything to follow Jesus. They had witnessed his incredible miracles, absorbed his profound teachings, and seen his absolute authority over nature and demons. They believed firmly that he was the promised Messiah who would restore the glory of Israel and establish God's kingdom on the earth. And now he was telling them that their reward for total devotion would be widespread suffering and inevitable violent death. He described the coming spiritual stumbling, pointing toward the distant temple which was now entirely shrouded in deep shadow. And then many faithful followers will fall away and abandon the faith, and they will betray one another and ultimately hate one another. He felt the increasing night cold penetrating through their thin tunics. The persecution would not just originate from hostile outside forces. It would tragically come from within their own ranks. People who had genuinely claimed to follow Jesus would turn violently against each other when the pressure became intense and unbearable. This internal betrayal would be agonizingly personal and utterly devastating. Friends would willingly inform on friends. Family members would turn in their own relatives. The fundamental bonds of love and loyalty that held communities together would suddenly snap under the immense weight of terror and the instinct for self-preservation. The very people they trusted most implicitly would suddenly become their greatest, most lethal enemies. Jesus spoke clearly of the rise of false prophets, gesturing with precise movements. And many false prophets will arise and successfully lead many people astray. The disciples nervously exchanged quick glances while the wind began to howl softly and mournfully through the trees. These would not be obvious, clumsy frauds. They would be highly convincing, magnetic speakers who could easily quote scripture and perform mesmerizing signs. They would claim immediate divine revelation and quickly gather passionate followers who would ferociously defend them. He warned clearly about the relentless increase of lawlessness with a low, grave voice. And because lawlessness will be multiplied aggressively, the love of many people will grow entirely cold. Jesus touched James's shoulder to reinforce the deep emotional weight of the words. Ponder that precise phrase. The love of many will grow cold. This implied not just a surge in criminal behavior, but the very essence of human compassion withering away and dying. This was not simply about people breaking moral laws. It was about the complete, catastrophic breakdown of fundamental human decency. When lawlessness rapidly multiplies, when total chaos becomes the accepted normal state, when violence is constant and omnipresent, people instinctively protect themselves by ruthlessly hardening their hearts. They cease caring about the suffering of others because caring hurts too much and makes them vulnerable. Jesus then offered encouragement for perseverance, lifting his head slightly. But the one who steadfastly endures to the very end will be saved. He felt the crisp night breeze tousle his hair, while the disciples absorbed the promise with determined, weary looks. After vividly painting this dark, sweeping picture of deception, endless war, fierce persecution, an agonizing betrayal, Jesus offered a profound flicker of hope. Not everyone would fall away and fail. Not everyone's love would grow cold and die. Some dedicated souls would endure, surviving until the promised end. He then announced the unstoppable global preaching of the gospel, pointing toward the dark, vast horizon. And this gospel of the kingdom will be loudly proclaimed throughout the entire world as a living testimony to all nations. And only then will the final end come. The distant, mournful sound of an owl hooting punctuated the heavy silence of the moment. Before the absolute end could arrive, the good news about God's eternal kingdom would be required to reach every single nation and ethnic group on earth. This was not mere wishful thinking. It was a prophetic certainty about a global mission that would eventually span the entire globe and touch every single people group. What consuming thoughts raced through Peter's mind as he tried to imagine entire nations actively hating them simply because of Jesus' name? Picture the humble fisherman from Galilee desperately trying to process this terrifying reality. He had spent his life in a small fishing village where everyone knew everyone else. His world was confined to boats and nets, familiar faces and local customs. The idea of persecution from his own people was already nearly impossible to grasp. But hatred from all nations, from countless peoples he had never met, in distant lands he had never seen, speaking languages he had never heard, was unfathomable. Peter's mind raced as he struggled to understand how the simple, powerful message of Jesus could provoke such widespread, universal hostility. This was not mere rejection or apathy. This was virulent, active hatred. Nations would despise them specifically because they publicly carried Jesus' name. Ponder that sobering fact. The very name that brought them hope and profound joy would instantly make them targets of extreme violence across the entire known world. He thought of his brother Andrew, who was sitting quietly beside him, of James and John, of all the other disciples gathered tightly in this circle. These were just ordinary working men, fishermen, a tax collector, laboring people with families and civic responsibilities. How could their simple, life-changing message about a carpenter from Nazareth possibly generate such overwhelming worldwide opposition? Yet Jesus spoke with absolute, unwavering certainty about this hostile future. The psychological weight of what lay immediately ahead pressed down heavily upon Peter's chest, like a suffocating stone. He had already witnessed the escalating animosity of the religious leaders toward Jesus. He had seen the fickleness of the crowds, praising Jesus one day and questioning his sanity the next. But this was fundamentally different. This was systematic, generation-spanning persecution on a global scale, crossing every known border and boundary. Jesus abruptly shifted his tone to one of greater, more immediate urgency. And finally, he would speak directly of the 4 dangerous places where you must absolutely never be found. He leaned forward, his focus even more intense. Therefore, when you actually see the abomination of desolation, the horrific event spoken of by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, he gestured deliberately toward the temple, which was now completely invisible in the total darkness of the night. The disciples strained their eyes to see where he pointed, but the magnificent structure had vanished entirely, consumed by the black night. This precise moment would be the tipping point, the instant everything changed. Jesus was referencing a prophecy that every single devout Jew knew deeply but desperately hoped they would never live to witness. Daniel had foretold an abomination that would utterly desecrate the holy place, an act so vile, so blasphemous, that it would serve as the definitive signal for unprecedented divine judgment. The disciples had heard the scribes fiercely debate the cryptic meaning of Daniel's words for years, but none of those abstract discussions had remotely prepared them for this specific, shattering moment when Jesus made the prophecy intensely personal and immediately relevant. He quoted Daniel directly with a clear, resonant voice. Let the reader understand. He felt the rough texture of the stone beneath his hands while the disciples intensely furrowed their brows in deep concentration. Matthew 24 verse 15 records these exact words. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Notice that crucial final phrase. Let the reader understand. This was not just historical background information Jesus was providing. This was a coded signal, a specific identifier, a life-saving warning that would be meticulously preserved in writing for future generations to recognize the precise moment the crisis arrived. When they clearly saw this abomination standing exactly where it should never, ever stand, they would instantly know precisely what must be done. Jesus commanded immediate, panicked flight for those in Judea, pointing urgently toward the mountains that encircled them. Then, let those who are in Judea flee instantly to the mountains. The sound of his urgent voice echoed sharply against the cold, hard rocks of the night. This was not a careful suggestion for future deliberation. This was a critical command for immediate, instantaneous action. When they saw the abomination, there would be no allotted time for formulating a plan, no time for theological debate, no time for gathering survival supplies. There would only be time left for desperate, headlong running. Ponder the terrifying implication of this. Judea was the very heartland of Jewish faith and culture. Jerusalem was the irreplaceable center of their religious life. The temple was the single spot where God's presence had dwelt among his people. And Jesus was telling them that the moment they saw the sign, they must instantly abandon it all and run desperately for their lives into the wilderness. He warned sternly against delays on rooftops, describing the peril vividly. Let the one who is currently on the housetop not go down into the house to retrieve what is inside his dwelling. He felt the mountain's cold air stiffen his exposed fingers. In that culture, flat rooftops served as essential living spaces, places for work, socializing, and rest. People kept important, valuable possessions there. But Jesus was warning that when the critical moment arrived, even the few seconds it would take to snatch essential items could mean the difference between escape and certain death. Picture the shocking scene. A man is on his rooftop when he sees the sign. His primal instinct would be to race down into his house and grab food, money, clothing, the absolute basic necessities for survival. But Jesus was warning that this natural, survival-driven response would be lethal. The urgency of the disaster would be so extreme that even these few moments of delay would fatally trap him in the coming destruction. Jesus continued with warnings for those caught working in the field, gesturing toward the valleys below. And let the one who is in the field not turn back, not even for a moment, to get his cloak. The disciples imagined the sudden panic of a flight while the heavy night silence enveloped them. A man working in the field would be wearing only his basic tunic. His cloak, absolutely essential for warmth and comfort after sundown, would be back at his house. But Jesus was stating clearly that turning back for even this essential piece of garment would be a deadly, fatal mistake. Consider the level of desperation this implies. People would be so hyper-focused on immediate, moment-to-moment survival that they would abandon absolutely everything that normally defined their lives. Possessions, comfort, security. All of it would become utterly worthless in the face of the approaching, unprecedented catastrophe. The only thing that would matter in that hour would be creating maximum distance from the impending destruction. He expressed profound compassion for pregnant and nursing mothers with a gentle but gravely serious tone. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those awful days. Jesus touched the ground with his hand to emphasize the sheer physical hardship of the desperate journey. This was not merely about the physical difficulty of travel over rough ground. Pregnant women and nursing mothers would inevitably be the most vulnerable individuals during a frantic, desperate flight toward the distant mountains. Imagine a pregnant woman in her final months attempting to make this journey quickly on foot over the treacherous, rough terrain. Picture a mother with a helpless newborn baby attempting to flee through mountain passes without adequate food, reliable shelter, or any medical care whatsoever. The very people who most desperately needed safety and stability would be utterly exposed, be forced into the most dangerous and unstable conditions imaginable. They would be exposed to the elements, hunted, and without resources. Jesus instructed them to pray specifically against flight in winter, describing the crippling hardship the cold would bring. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. He felt the cutting night wind on the Mount of Olives as a tangible foretaste of the difficulties to come. Winter travel in the high, unforgiving mountains of Judea would be treacherous even under the best, most carefully planned circumstances. During a desperate, unplanned flight lacking provisions or safe passage, It would be potentially fatal, an almost certain death sentence due to exposure and exhaustion. He prophesied the Great Tribulation, raising his voice dramatically above the dark valley floor, giving gravity to the word. For then there will be great tribulation such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be. The terrible, absolute finality of the statement echoed across the dark expanse of the mount. Matthew 24 verse 21 confirms these exact words, sealing the prophecy. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. Read that again. This period would constitute the worst period in all human history, the benchmark of absolute human misery. Worse than the flood that destroyed the ancient world and reshaped the entire globe. Worse than any plague, any concentrated war, or any global catastrophe that had ever occurred, and worse than anything that would ever happen again. This wasn't merely passionate rhetoric or hyperbole. This was Jesus describing a level of suffering, destruction, and moral decay that would define the absolute limit of human physical and psychological endurance. Jesus then explained the shortening of the days, giving a profound expression of divine mercy. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. He gestured toward the infinite, starry sky above them. Think about what this implies. The tribulation would be so severe, so universally destructive, so devastating in its spiritual and physical impact that if it were permitted to continue unchecked for its natural course, it would result in the complete extinction of humanity. No human being, not the strong, not the prepared survivalist, not the hidden recluse, no one would survive the intensity of that judgment. But God would intervene, not because the mass of humanity deserved a reprieve, but solely because of the elect, those he had chosen throughout time. For their sake, he would miraculously cut the suffering short. Picture this precise divine calculation. The tribulation would reach a point where even one more day would push humanity past the irreversible point of no return toward utter annihilation. And at that precise moment, God would declare, "Enough." The disciples felt the profound weight of this mercy settling over them like a heavy, protective blanket. They were hearing about the darkest, most terrifying period in human history, but simultaneously, they heard about God's unwavering commitment to preserve a faithful remnant. Even in the midst of unprecedented judgment, divine love would set a merciful, necessary limit on the suffering. He warned against false messiahs again, pointing his finger in various imaginary directions across the landscape. Then if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "There he is," do not believe it. Jesus felt the chilling night dew beginning to form on the grass and rocks around them. This crucial warning came immediately after his description of the Great Tribulation for a profound reason. During times of such extreme, existential suffering, people become utterly desperate for deliverance, immediate relief, and certainty. They will believe almost anyone, any convincing figure who promises a swift end to their agony. Picture what this desperation would truly look like. Entire cities reduced to smoking ruins, families utterly torn apart, terrified survivors hiding miserably in caves, bunkers, and makeshift shelters. Into this vast, terrifying chaos would step convincing, charismatic figures claiming to be the promised deliverer, the solution foretold by prophecy. They would point to the overwhelming suffering around them as irrefutable proof that the Messianic age had arrived in judgment and that they themselves were the key to salvation. Jesus described the phenomenon of false miraculous signs with a tone of deep caution and solemnity. For false messiahs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. The disciples felt a collective chill as they vividly imagined the scope of this unprecedented deception. Read that again. Great signs and wonders. These wouldn't be cheap parlor tricks, stage magic, or obvious, easily debunked frauds. These would be genuine, supernatural demonstrations of power, satanically empowered, that would be so convincing, so overwhelming, that they would mislead even the most discerning observers. Think about how strategically powerful this deception would be. The false messiahs wouldn't simply make unsubstantiated claims. They would back them up with compelling, miraculous proof. They might heal the critically sick, demonstrate control over the weather and natural elements, perhaps even perform the ultimate counterfeiting act of raising the dead. The very evidence that people would naturally look for to validate a true messenger from God would be counterfeited flawlessly by these ultimate deceivers. Even the elect, those specifically chosen by God himself, would be at severe risk of being deceived. If possible, Jesus said. This carefully chosen phrase suggests that ultimately God's sovereignty would protect his chosen ones from falling definitively for the deception, but the temptation, the visible proof, would be so stunningly strong that even they would feel its irresistible pull. He reinforced the previous warning, repeating with emphatic seriousness, "See, I have told you beforehand." Jesus touched Andrew's arm gently, aiming to anchor this critical memory deeply within the group. This was not merely interesting new information he was sharing casually. This was crucial, actionable intelligence about future events, a vital survival guide that could mean the difference between spiritual life and spiritual death. He wanted them to remember this precise moment, this stark warning. When the time came, Jesus warned about desert rumors, gesturing toward the invisible, arid lands outside Jerusalem. So if they say to you, "Look, he is in the wilderness," do not go out. The amplified sound of nocturnal insects buzzing around them seemed to intensify the tension in the night air. The wilderness held tremendous special significance in Jewish thought and history. It was the place where Moses had encountered God in the burning bush, where Elijah had fled from the murderous Queen Jezebel, where Israel had been tested for 40 years, and where John the Baptist had ministered and preached. People would naturally assume that a true Messiah might appear there first, initiating a new exodus or revival. But Jesus was warning them not to chase these dramatic rumors. Don't go out to the wilderness to investigate spurious reports of the Messiah's sudden appearance. Don't join the massive crowds rushing senselessly to remote locations based on unreliable, second-hand testimony. Don't abandon your post or your duty to chase after what might seem like the fulfilling culmination of ancient prophecies. He continued with warnings about secret chambers, adopting a firm, uncompromising voice. If they say, "Look, he is in the inner rooms," do not believe it. He felt the solid weight of the rock beneath him, serving as a silent symbol of stability amid impending global chaos. Matthew 24 verse 26 records these exact words, cementing the parallel warning. "Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not." The inner rooms represented the polar opposite extreme from the public wilderness. Instead of staging grand, public appearances in remote, revival-style locations, these false messiahs would claim to be operating in complete secrecy, meeting only with select, chosen followers in hidden, guarded chambers. They would deliberately create an aura of mystery and exclusivity, suggesting that only the initiated, the truly enlightened, could access the true deliverer and his message. Think about how incredibly appealing this would be to people suffering acutely under relentless persecution. Secret meetings would feel immeasurably safer than risky public gatherings. Exclusive, private access would feel far more precious and validating than mass rallies. The very hiddenness, the cloak of secrecy, would seem to validate the authenticity of the experience to the desperate. Jesus compared his coming to lightning, raising his eyes sharply to the expansive night sky. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. The distant, steady glitter of stars punctuated his powerful words. This simple cosmic image was the ultimate antidote to all the confusing deception he had just described. When the real Christ came, there would be no question, no doubt, no ambiguity, and absolutely no need for prolonged investigation or external verification. Lightning does not require an official announcement or subjective interpretation. You don't need someone to stand next to you and tell you that lightning has struck. You see it instantly, universally, across the entire visible sky. Jesus was declaring that his return would be equally obvious, equally impossible to miss, and equally visible to everyone everywhere on the planet simultaneously. He described corpses and vultures with a sudden, somber tone. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. He felt the thick night air heavy with the weight of prophecy while the disciples processed the gruesome, vivid imagery. This was a proverb about the grim, inexorable inevitability of judgment. Where there is spiritual death, the instruments of judgment, the executioners of divine decree, will inevitably and surely appear. Think about what this meant in context. The false messiahs and their devoted followers, being spiritually dead in their deception and active rebellion, would be like spiritual corpses lying exposed on the landscape. And just as predatory vultures are drawn to carrion by an unerring instinct, divine judgment would be instantly drawn to these centers of spiritual corruption and falsehood. Jesus moved on to the cosmic signs that would follow the tribulation, gesturing dramatically toward the dark, overarching sky. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The wind seemed to howl around them like a mournful echo of future disturbances. After the worst, most concentrated period of human suffering in history would come supernatural signs that would affect the very fabric of creation itself, signaling a cosmic shift. He continued with falling stars, pointing upward to the celestial sphere. And the stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. The disciples felt the vast, seemingly eternal sky above them as if it already trembled under prophetic strain. Think about the scale of what they were hearing. The sun going dark, ceasing to provide life-giving light. The moon failing utterly to give illumination. Stars falling from their fixed ancient positions. The very powers, the unseen cosmic forces that govern and hold together the heavens, being shaken like helpless leaves in a violent storm. These weren't just localized earthly catastrophes. This was a cosmic upheaval, the deconstruction of the universe, that would touch every corner of creation and definitively signal that the end of the current age had finally arrived. Matthew 24 verse 29 records these exact, terrifying words. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Read that again. The sun darkened, the moon giving no light, stars streaking from heaven. The very powers that held the cosmos together would be violently shaken apart. Picture what this shocking spectacle would look like to the people who had just barely survived the worst period of human suffering in history. They would emerge, blinking, from caves and ruins, from their hiding places and mountain refuges, thinking that surely the worst was finally over. And then they would look up to see the sun failing, the moon dark, and stars streaking across the sky like apocalyptic rain. Jesus announced the sign of the Son of Man with a triumphant, final voice. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. He touched the ground gently to symbolize the entire, inhabited earth. Think deeply about that phrase. All the tribes of the earth will mourn. Not just some regions or certain populations, but every people group, every culture, across the entire globe would simultaneously witness something that would instantly trigger universal, immediate grief. What exactly would this sign be? Jesus didn't specify the form it would take, but its appearance would be unmistakable to every single human being alive. The mourning wouldn't be the grief of loss, but the paralyzing terror of recognition. This would be the definitive moment when every knee would bow and every tongue confess, not in joyous worship, but in the horrible, crushing realization that final judgment had arrived. He described the coming in the clouds, raising his hands in a gesture of ultimate authority. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Jesus felt the gentle breeze on his face, perceiving it as a distant, massive celestial movement beginning. This was the glorious, defining event that prophets had foretold for millennia, that Psalms had celebrated, and that the faithful had longed for across generations. Think about the absolute contrast. Throughout his earthly ministry, Jesus had appeared as a humble, itinerant carpenter, walking dusty roads, sleeping in borrowed beds. But when he returned, it would be with power that shook the cosmos and glory that outshone the very sun itself. Jesus spoke of sending angels, gesturing broadly to the north, south, east, and west. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. The imagined, thunderous sound of trumpets echoed in their minds, signaling a divine muster. After all the pervasive deception, all the false messiahs, and all the lying wonders, there would finally be a genuine, glorious supernatural intervention. These powerful angels would have one singular mission: to gather the elect. From every hidden corner of the earth, from deep hiding places and scattered refugee camps, from prisons and remote settlements, they would meticulously collect those who belong to God. No one would be overlooked, and absolutely no one would be forgotten or lost. He used the fig tree as a simple, powerful parable, pointing to a nearby tree whose dry leaves rustled slightly. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. Jesus felt the dry leaves under his feet, emphasizing the natural cycle. This was basic agricultural wisdom that every person in that culture intuitively understood. Jesus applied the lesson directly to their generation with an assertive, definite tone. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very gates. The disciples nodded in realization while the night deepened the sense of mystery and destiny around them. Matthew 24 verses 32 to 33 confirms these words with precision. Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and putteth forth leaves, ye know that summer is nigh. So likewise ye, when ye shall see all these things, know that it is near, even at the doors. The signs were not random, disconnected events scattered haphazardly across history. They were like the tender branches and new leaves of the fig tree, clear, recognizable, sequential indicators that the grand harvest, the end, was actively approaching. He declared the permanence of his words, raising his voice with unparalleled authority. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Jesus felt the eternal truth of his statement in stark contrast to the temporal, decaying world around them. Think about the staggering claim he was making. The physical universe itself, the sun, moon, and stars he had just described as shaking, would eventually pass away, be dissolved. But the words he was speaking on this mountain would outlast creation itself, standing as immutable truth. Jesus warned about the uncertainty of the exact hour with an enigmatic, serious expression. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. He touched his own forehead, emphasizing the divine, guarded secret held only by the first person of the Trinity. After giving them incredibly detailed signs to watch for, Jesus reminded them that the precise, final timing remained deliberately hidden in the Father's sovereign will. He compared it instantly to the flood, vividly describing ancient, oblivious scenes. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. The disciples imagined chaotic, rising waters while the mount remained silent and dark around them. This chilling comparison would have sent tremors of fear through every listener who knew the terrible ancient stories. Jesus detailed the pre-flood normalcy, gesturing in an everyday common fashion. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. He felt the jarring contrast between this human routine and the impending divine judgment. People would be absorbed entirely in their normal lives, celebrating weddings, diligently planning futures, building businesses, pursuing mundane tasks, completely and fatally unaware that everything was about to change forever in a violent, final way. He continued with the theme of sudden ignorance, speaking with a tone of surprise at their blindness. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. The night wind carried a heavy, palpable sense of inevitability across the mountain. Think about that powerful phrase. They were unaware. These weren't people living in obvious, overt sin or open public rebellion, necessarily. They were simply going about normal, everyday activities. Eating, drinking, getting married, making plans for tomorrow. Matthew 24 verses 37 to 39 records these exact words, highlighting the fatal blindness. But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Read that again. They knew not until the flood came and took them all away. Picture what this truly means. For decades, Noah had been faithfully building his massive ark, a towering testament to judgment, in full view of his neighbors. He had preached persistently about the coming judgment. He had warned about divine wrath. But people had grown completely accustomed to the warnings. They had heard it all before, and they dismissed him. The ark simply became part of the landscape. Noah's preaching became tedious background noise, and life went on as usual, until the day the rain started. Then it was too late for preparation, too late for repentance, too late for anything except the terrible realization that the crazy old man had been absolutely right all along. The flood didn't arrive gradually. It came suddenly, violently, sweeping away an entire civilization in a matter of days. Jesus described the sudden, dramatic separations in the field, pointing toward invisible valleys below. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. He felt the spiritual division like a sharp, invisible blade cutting through the air. Picture 2 farmers working side by side in the same field, performing the same monotonous work, living apparently identical, synchronized lives. But when the precise moment comes, one would be instantly taken by the angels, and the other left behind to face judgment. This wasn't about geographical location or occupation or even outward, visible behavior. This was about something infinitely deeper, a fundamental, unseen difference in spiritual condition that would only be revealed fully at the moment of divine intervention. The separation would be instantaneous, shocking, and irreversible. He continued with the image of the grinding mill, gesturing the routine motion of grinding grain. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and one left. The disciples felt the heavy weight of unexpected, terrifying selection. This image would have been especially vivid to them. Women grinding grain together at the communal mill was a daily, common sight in every village. They would chat while they worked, sharing news and gossip, their lives intimately intertwined by routine and friendship. But when the end came, even these closest, most intimate relationships would be violently severed by divine judgment. One woman would be taken, the other left behind. Despite their proximity and shared daily experience, their ultimate destinations were polarized. Think about the shock, the confusion, the frantic, desperate questions that would immediately follow such instantaneous separations. Jesus exhorted them strongly to watchfulness with an imperative voice. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. He touched their shoulders to physically awaken their full, sustained attention. This was not the passive waiting of a man resting. This was active vigilance, constant readiness, persistent alertness to the signs of the times. The Greek word translated as watch or stay awake carried serious military connotations. It meant standing guard duty through the long night, maintaining maximum alertness during the dangerous hours of darkness, being ready to sound the alarm at the first sign of enemy approach. Jesus was telling them, effectively, to live as soldiers perpetually on duty in hostile territory. He used the thief as a clear example, describing a terrifying nighttime invasion. But know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. The sound of imaginary, silent footsteps echoed menacingly in the darkness around them. Think about what this comparison reveals. Thieves never announce their arrival. They don't send advanced warning or schedule appointments. They come specifically when the household is deepest asleep, when defenses are down, when no one expects them. The homeowner's only genuine protection is constant vigilance, staying awake, listening intently for unusual sounds, being ready to respond immediately at any moment. But there was a profound irony in this analogy. A natural homeowner might eventually grow tired and fall asleep, making himself vulnerable to the thief. But the return of Christ would not be a theft. It would be the rightful, glorious owner reclaiming his property and settling accounts. Those who were truly watching for him wouldn't perceive him as an intruder, but as their long-awaited, sovereign deliverer. Jesus concluded about readiness, rising slightly to stand, giving his words weight. Therefore, you also must be ready, For the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. He felt the mount beneath him like an eternal, immovable guard post. Matthew 24 verses 42 to 44 confirms these words with finality. Watch therefore, for ye know not what hour your Lord doth come. But know this, that if the goodman of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched, and would not have suffered his house to be broken up. Therefore, be ye also ready, for in such an hour as ye think not the Son of Man cometh. This was the inescapable paradox of divine timing. They would have definitive signs to watch for: the abomination of desolation, the great tribulation, the cosmic upheaval. But within that general, prophesied time frame, the exact moment would remain utterly unpredictable. Ready or not, he would come. The disciples absorbed the overwhelming words in deep, heavy silence, feeling the night cold enveloping their bodies like a cloak of stern warning, while Jesus remained seated, his eyes fixed on the black horizon. The accumulated weight of everything they had heard: wars, persecution, massive deception, cosmic chaos, sudden separation, and through it all the constant, exhausting need for vigilance, pressed down on them like a heavy, immovable stone. Peter broke the silence with a whispered, hesitant question, touching his beard thoughtfully. Lord, how can we prepare for these times? The sound of his voice trembled slightly in the cold, still air. After hearing about tribulation beyond imagination and separation without warning, the practical fishermen wanted to know, concretely, what they could actually do to survive and remain faithful. Jesus responded with a parable about the faithful servant, gesturing with immediate authority. Who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom his master has set stewardship over his household to give them their food at the proper time? The weight of this immense responsibility settled upon his shoulders, heavy and demanding, like a newly fastened cloak that he could never remove. Jesus' tone shifted to one of warm approval as he detailed the blessing awaiting the watchful manager. Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. The disciples, looking up at the steady flicker of stars scattered across the vast, silent night sky, internalized the promised reward, a recognition far greater than any earthly payment. They envisioned the scene clearly. The master returns from an arduous, unexpectedly lengthy journey, not to chaos, but to his servants still diligently attending to every minute duty. No corners had been cut during the period of unsupervised autonomy. There was no slackening of standards just because the authority figure was out of sight. The faithful servant had rejected the assumption that delayed return meant postponed or canceled accountability. Far from merely meeting the bare minimum, this steward had consistently provided the household their necessary provisions at the precise moment required, meticulously managed the estate's resources, and, crucially, had governed everyone under his charge with an unwavering commitment to justice and compassion. When the master's familiar footsteps finally echoed across the stone courtyard, this servant did not have to look up in paralyzed panic. He could rise from his work with serene, unshakable confidence. Ponder the profound significance of this blessing. It meant not merely escaping severe punishment, but instead earning the highest possible commendation directly from the master's own lips. To hear the words, "Well done," spoken by the one whose approval superseded all others. This was the recognition that the profound trust placed in him had been completely and sacredly honored. Jesus' voice then dropped, shifting to a severe and ominous warning about the wicked servant. But if that wicked servant says to himself, "My master is delayed," he instinctively raised his hand and touched his own chest, emphasizing the core of the problem, the corrupting power of a self-deceiving heart. Note precisely where the descent began. It was not initiated by an outright public act of rebellion against the master's decree, but by a sly internal rationalization. The servant never officially rejected the master's established authority. He simply permitted himself to be convinced that the time for reckoning had been indefinitely postponed. This was the critical, fatal flaw born of procrastination and spiritual apathy. He started to believe that because judgment had not arrived immediately, it might never arrive at all. He fundamentally confused divine patience, which was meant to offer time for repentance, with divine indifference. He disastrously mistook delay for cancellation. Once that poisonous thought took root in the center of his heart, everything that followed was an inevitable, disastrous consequence. Jesus then meticulously detailed the progression of this negligence, describing the abuses, saying he begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards. The imaginary sound of painful blows and the drunken clamor of a misused household echoed with stark clarity in the minds of the listening disciples. Reflect on the speed and severity of this corruption's progression. First, the steward abandoned his fundamental duty to care for the needs of the household. Next, he turned his delegated authority into a means of systematic abuse against those placed under his protection. Finally, he gave himself over entirely to self-indulgent, reckless pleasure, keeping company with dissolute and harmful companions. Visualize the horrific reality of this betrayal. Fellow servants who had once relied on him for leadership and security now cowered in terror, fearing his arbitrary violence. Resources meant to sustain and care for the vulnerable household were shamelessly squandered on loud, debauched parties. The very people he was commissioned to serve became the immediate victims of his calculated cruelty and neglect. This was far more than mere personal moral failure. It was the ultimate, heinous betrayal of a sacred trust. The master had appointed him specifically to look after others, and he had inverted that position, using it to inflict harm. The authority intended for benevolent protection had been deliberately twisted into a weapon of oppression. Jesus urgently prophesied the master's surprise return. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know. Jesus conveyed the unpredictable, swift nature of divine timing, feeling it like an approaching shadow in the dead of night. The wicked servant's ultimate mistake was the presumption that he would receive some form of advanced warning before his accountability arrived. Consider the sheer, paralyzing shock of that moment. The servant, likely still steeped in the fumes of wine and the aftermath of violence, suddenly hears utterly unexpected footsteps resounding in the outer compound. The horrifying, instant realization crashes over him. The master has returned, not tomorrow, not next week, but now. The devastating understanding that there is no time left to correct his trajectory, no chance to undo the damage already inflicted, and absolutely no opportunity to hastily construct a facade of faithfulness. Jesus described the ensuing punishment, gesturing a definitive separation, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The raw severity of the description made the disciples feel a phantom, grinding ache in their own jaws as they internalized the image of divine justice. Matthew 24 verses 48 to 51 records these exact, immutable words. Read that again. Cut him in pieces. This punishment was not merely a straightforward dismissal from service or a public reprimand. This was the prophesied, complete destruction of the wicked servant, followed by his permanent assignment to the place of ultimate, eternal punishment. The steward who had systematically used his delegated position to inflict suffering on others would discover that divine justice, though patient, was both absolutely certain and overwhelmingly severe. What was the beloved disciple John experiencing as he visualized the sun darkening and the stars plummeting during the Great Tribulation? John, who would later be given the staggering cosmic visions recorded in the book of Revelation, felt his heart pound frantically in his chest as he struggled to grasp the sheer scope of the cosmic disruption Jesus was detailing. He had witnessed Jesus effortlessly calming savage storms and walking on unstable water. But this was fundamentally different. This was the Creator himself actively intervening and altering the very foundational laws that govern his universe. John imagined himself standing right there on the Mount of Olives on that dreadful future day, watching the sun's light recede like a fading ember and stars streaking violently across the firmament like burning, celestial tears. He felt a profound sense of terror at the unimaginable magnitude of divine power, yet interwoven with that fear was a strange, powerful comfort in the knowledge that the very Jesus sitting beside him now would be the one orchestrating these earth-shattering cosmic events for the certain salvation of his faithful people. Jesus rose deliberately from the cold stone, a quiet but firm signal that the profound instruction was concluded. Feeling the evening dew clinging to his sandals while the disciples stood rigid beside him, their eyes reflecting a mixture of resolute determination and residual fear. The long, sweeping discourse was now complete. Everything they needed to understand about the final era had been unveiled. Now their daunting task was to carry this knowledge, this prophetic burden, through the decades ahead, watching diligently for the subtle signs, preparing inwardly and outwardly for the inevitable challenges, and remaining absolutely faithful to their duty until the destined end. They began their descent down the mount in a profound, reflective silence, navigating the irregular, dark stones of the path. The soft sound of their footsteps echoed not just in the night, but like a hushed prelude to the momentous events that had just been prophesied, while the sleeping city of Jerusalem lay oblivious in the distance. Every single step down the hill carried them nearer to a world utterly unaware of the terrible things to come. The temple still shone magnificently under the moon's pale light, but they now carried the shattering knowledge that its days were irrevocably numbered. Peter turned to James on the steep, descending path, his voice low and barely audible, the weight of the confidential message heavy against his chest. Should we tell the others about this? This was not trivial, casual information to be disseminated lightly. This was vital prophetic intelligence concerning the future of human history and the fate of their world. James responded with a brief, affirming nod, gently resting his hand on his brother's arm. Yes, but carefully. We must ensure they grasp the urgency, not just the details. The night air felt thick with profound secrets, and the ancient olive trees whispered their secrets to the passing wind. The message demanded to be shared, but only with wisdom and cautious discretion. People needed the warning, but it had to be delivered in a way that would spur them to preparation rather than drive them into sheer panic. John walked closely alongside Jesus, absorbing every physical and spiritual detail of the moment, feeling the damp ground beneath his feet, a visceral reminder of the very earth that would soon tremble under judgment. Andrew trailed at the rear of the small group, occasionally glancing back at the now dark, silent mountain, visualizing the spectacular cosmic signs. His heart pulsed rapidly with vivid, internal visions of angels sounding terrifying trumpets. The Mount of Olives had receded into a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky, yet in Andrew's mind's eye, he could still see it clearly as the future stage for the most dramatic, climactic events in all human history. He pictured majestic angels descending, heralded by trumpet calls that would resonate across every single continent, gathering the chosen elect from the four corners of the world, while the heavens themselves shook and convulsed under the pressure of divine power. Reflect on the whirlwind of thoughts passing through Andrew's mind. He had just heard Jesus describe the complete collapse of everything familiar and stable, the sun and moon failing, stars raining down, the very powers that govern the cosmos being shaken violently. Yet, miraculously intertwined with this profound terror was an incredible, electrifying sense of anticipation. Those same earth-shattering cosmic upheavals would simultaneously signal the glorious arrival of their master, the absolute vindication of everything they had suffered for, and the ultimate dawn of the kingdom they had yearned to see. They finally reached the base of the mountain and entered the sleeping city. Wooden doors creaked softly as they closed behind them, and the gentle scent of night-baked bread mingled powerfully with the memory of the fresh prophecy they carried. Jerusalem lay in profound, peaceful slumber, utterly unaware of the seismic spiritual revelation that had just taken place on the height above. Shopkeepers rested beside their locked stalls. Priests were asleep in their quarters near the looming temple. Families dreamed quietly in their humble homes, all completely oblivious to the fact that their city's fate had just been irrevocably sealed by divine prophecy. The contrast was stunning and tragic. While Jesus had been unveiling the terrifying future of the world, the mundane rhythm of daily life in the city had continued unimpeded. People had finished their evening meals, tucked their children into bed, and banked their fires for the night. The bread they smelled baking now was being prepared by bakers who had no possible idea that the magnificent temple they served would one day be utterly reduced to rubble. Jesus stopped at a humble house, turning to face them one last time. "Remember what I have told you." He felt the gentle warmth of a nearby torch flickering, its light illuminating their weary, worried faces. This was far from a casual farewell. It was a solemn, absolute charge, a commission to preserve and fiercely protect the critical prophetic knowledge they had been entrusted with. These words, meticulously stored, would need to sustain them through intense persecution, guide them through dangerous deception, and prepare them for the worst tribulation. Look at the intense focus etched onto their faces in that wavering torchlight. These were no longer the same men who had marveled innocently at the temple's polished stones just hours earlier. They had been irreversibly transformed by revelation, burdened with tremendous prophetic responsibility, and commissioned as watchmen for the final era. The sheer weight of what they had heard was evident in every line of deep concern around their eyes. The disciples dispersed quietly to their respective sleeping places, lying down on rough straw mats. The irregular, labored sound of breathing filled the small room while vivid, apocalyptic visions immediately invaded their minds. Sleep, when it finally arrived, was restlessly fragmented and dominated by images of cosmic upheaval. Their minds could not simply switch off after hearing about the most devastating period in human history, global divine judgment, and celestial chaos. Peter woke briefly in the frigid early hours, a cold sweat dampening his forehead, and murmured urgently to himself, "Flee to the mountains." Moonlight streamed through the narrow window, appearing like a distant, urgent sign. Even in his semi-conscious state, the absolute urgency of Jesus' specific warnings echoed relentlessly in his mind. The command to flee was not merely abstract theological instruction. It was vital, practical survival information that could mean the literal difference between life and death for future generations of believers. Consider what this subconscious reaction reveals about the powerful impact of Jesus' delivery. Peter, the famously impulsive fisherman who often spoke impulsively, was now so profoundly affected by the prophecy that it had colonized his sleep. The warning about immediate, panicked flight to the surrounding mountains had lodged itself deep within his subconscious as a life-and-death imperative. James tossed violently in his sleep, dreaming of massive lightning bolts arcing across a turbulent sky, and felt the imaginary tremor of the ground beneath his thin mat. His dreams blended the familiar reality of the earth with the terrifyingly fantastic. The usually stable ground seemed to shake violently. The dark sky outside was suddenly crackling with immense supernatural light. The powerful comparison Jesus had made between his return and the instantaneous flash of lightning had completely captivated James's imagination. John, even in the midst of troubled sleep, mentally recorded the words, feeling an invisible stylus carving them onto the tablet of his heart. "Do not go out to the wilderness." The night silence seemed to amplify the prophetic echo. Even in slumber, the beloved disciple was already initiating the meticulous process of preservation, a process that would ultimately result in his writing of the Gospel account and the spectacular book of Revelation. These were not mere memories he was passively storing. These were sacred, divine words that absolutely had to be transmitted accurately to future, struggling generations. Andrew prayed silently before sleep finally claimed him, clasping his hands together tightly. Let it not be in winter. He felt the distinct chill of the stone wall near him, a tactile warning of the physical hardships to come. The compassionate fisherman had been particularly moved by Jesus' explicit concern for vulnerable pregnant women and nursing mothers during the desperate flight. His prayer was not primarily for his own comfort, but a heartfelt plea for divine mercy upon the most fragile during the period of greatest tribulation. Jesus, however, remained profoundly awake, alone in solitary prayer, kneeling on the cold floor. He felt the Father's encompassing presence surrounding him, even as the oblivious city beneath continued to ignore the imminent warnings. While his disciples wrestled with their disturbing, vivid dreams, Jesus maintained deep communion with the one who had commissioned him. The tremendous burden of what was inevitably coming, not only for Jerusalem but for the entire world, pressed down upon him like a crushing, physical weight. Reflect upon this poignant scene. The Son of God kneeling in isolation in the darkness, bearing the full, terrible knowledge of humanity's future suffering. He knew precisely when the abomination would appear, exactly how devastatingly severe the tribulation would be, and precisely which generation would ultimately witness these apocalyptic events. And he carried this overwhelming knowledge in perfect, sorrowful submission to his Father's will, even as his human heart grieved profoundly for the impending tragedy. Daniel 12 verse 1 had prophesied about this exact time frame centuries earlier. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Read that again. A time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation. The prophet Daniel, separated by centuries, had envisioned the very same future epic that Jesus had just painstakingly described to his disciples. The Great Tribulation was not some new, shocking revelation. It was the absolute, culminating fulfillment of ancient prophecy, the convergence of divine warnings that had echoed faithfully through generations of watchmen. Yet, note the embedded, steadfast promise within Daniel's prophecy. Deliverance would assuredly come for those whose names were written in the book of life. Even in the absolute center of unprecedented, global suffering, God would remember and protect his people. Even during the darkest, most terrifying period in human history, divine mercy would provide an escape route for the chosen elect. The sun rose over Jerusalem the following morning, once again tinting the massive temple complex a brilliant, deceptive golden hue, while the disciples gathered, feeling the renewed weight of Jesus' words reverberating in their racing hearts. The familiar sight of morning light striking the towering temple walls took on a new, unsettling meaning. What had seemed only yesterday like an eternal symbol of divine favor and permanence now appeared fragile, temporal, and irrevocably marked for complete destruction. Every gleam of sunlight reflecting off the polished stones served as a stark reminder that these magnificent, world-renowned structures would one day be reduced to mere rubble. They exchanged meaningful, burdened glances during their shared morning meal, chewing on dry, hard bread and salty olives. The slightly bitter taste seemed to echo the prophesied affliction. This simple, routine breakfast now felt fundamentally different. Every bite carried the tremendous weight of the prophetic knowledge they possessed. The bread reminded them of the daily, mundane concerns that would instantly become meaningless when the abomination appeared. The olives, grown on ancient trees that had witnessed generations of history, would ironically outlast the temple structure itself. Consider what this seemingly simple meal represented. Yesterday morning, these men had been ordinary followers listening to their teacher. Today, they were the exclusive carriers of pivotal prophetic knowledge concerning the end of the world. The transformation was not just intellectual. It was intensely visceral. They could literally taste the sharp bitterness of the coming tribulation in their morning food. Peter finally broke the group's heavy silence, gesturing emphatically with the dry bread in his hand. "We must watch," he stated firmly. He felt the crusty texture of the bread as a constant, physical reminder of the necessity for continuous readiness. The impulsive fisherman had been profoundly affected by Jesus' emphasis on vigilance. He was not advocating passive, hopeful waiting, but intense, active alertness, the dedicated watchfulness maintained by a sentry-standing guard during wartime. James nodded his agreement with vigor, taking a long drink of cool, fresh water from a rough clay jar. The loud sound of his swallow echoed unnaturally in the simple room. Yes, and not believe false signs. The Son of Thunder had been particularly struck by Jesus' warnings concerning deception and false prophets. In times of profound crisis, people would be desperate for any sliver of hope, making them fatally vulnerable to anyone claiming divine or authoritative status. James understood that rigorous spiritual discernment would become a matter of literal survival. John added his voice quietly, his hand touching an imaginary scroll inscribed within his memory. "And endure to the end." He felt the morning air gently warming his exposed skin. The beloved disciple was already thinking like the future author of Revelation. Endurance would not merely mean surviving physical persecution. It would mean maintaining uncompromising faith through unprecedented suffering, holding steadfastly to the core truth even when everything familiar collapsed and crumbled around them. Andrew concluded their solemn conversation, rising purposefully from the table. "We flee when we see the abomination." The clean scent of morning herbs filled the confined space. The practical, measured fishermen had effectively distilled Jesus's complex, layered prophecy down to its most crucial, essential action point. When they saw the specified sign, there would be absolutely no time for paralyzing debate or deliberation, only the instant necessary flight toward the mountains. They stepped out into the bright day, instantly blending into the bustling crowd on the busy streets, feeling the loud buzz of voices as a potential prelude to the predicted rumors of wars. Jerusalem was already fully alive with activity. Merchants were hurriedly setting up their stalls. Children darted through the narrow passages. Pilgrims were making their dedicated way toward the grand temple courts. But to the disciples, every single conversation now seemed to carry immense potential significance. Any widespread discussion of simmering political tension could easily be the predicted beginning of the wars Jesus had foretold. Picture the radical change in their perception. They were walking through a city that physically appeared exactly the same as it had the day before, yet their internal understanding of reality had been completely and fundamentally transformed. Every Roman soldier they saw was a reminder of the coming oppression. Every heated discussion in the marketplace sounded like the preliminary rumors of wars that would precede the end. Jesus led the way back toward the temple complex, stepping onto the stones already warmed by the rapidly rising sun. The clamorous sound of merchants shouting their wares in the background created a powerful contrast with the silent, internal prophecy they carried. The teacher who had unequivocally pronounced the temple's destruction yesterday was now returning to teach and minister within its courts. This was not inconsistency. This was the steady fulfillment of his mission, to reach and warn as many people as humanly possible before the terrible end finally arrived. The disciples observed the temple structure with new, piercing eyes, seeing the massive stones as future ruins, feeling the sun beating heavily on the back of their necks as they processed its inevitable destiny. Those gigantic blocks that had seemed so enduring and permanent yesterday now appeared shockingly fragile. They could almost see directly through the impressive architectural facade to the rubble that would one day lie in its exact place. Every magnificent architectural detail that had once inspired awe now served as a sobering reminder of impermanence. Think about the power of this visual transformation. The same stones, the same golden gleam, the same impressive height, yet completely recontextualized by prophetic revelation. They were literally looking at a magnificent, condemned building that did not yet know its fate. They were seeing the future superimposed vividly onto the present. Peter whispered urgently to Jesus beside him, touching Jesus's tunic to ground his question. "Lord, what about the elect from the four winds?" The fisherman was still grappling with the sheer global scope of the gathering Jesus had described. How would angels manage to gather believers from every remote corner of the earth? What would that massive, precise operation look like in execution? How would they accurately identify the elect among all the earth's countless populations? Jesus answered briefly, without pausing or slowing his pace. "They will be gathered by the trumpet." He felt the powerful flow of the crowd pressing them steadily forward. This was not the time for a detailed, elaborate explanation, but the simple, concise answer carried profound implications. The same divine power that would violently shake the cosmos would also meticulously orchestrate the precise identification and perfect collection of every single believer scattered across the vast globe. Imagine the operation Jesus was describing. Angels armed with supernatural knowledge and limitless mobility conducting a meticulous, worldwide rescue mission. Not a single believer would be overlooked, regardless of how remote their location or how desperate their current circumstances. The same God who had numbered every hair on their heads would ensure that not one of his chosen elect would be left behind during the final gathering. The throng of humanity pressed tightly around them as they approached the bustling temple courts. A teeming sea of humanity completely unaware that they were walking shoulder to shoulder with the one who held the absolute keys to their future. Priests hurried past them carrying their ritual implements. Pilgrims pointed excitedly at the impressive architectural features. Children chased each other playfully between the giant columns, all utterly oblivious to the revolutionary prophetic knowledge walking silently in their midst. This was the deep, tragic irony of the moment. The very people who most desperately needed to hear Jesus' warnings were the ones least likely to believe them. The city that should have been preparing frantically for the tribulation was instead continuing its normal, confident routine, secure in its religious traditions and political stability, unaware that both were moments away from utter collapse. Revelation 7 verse 1 speaks to this pivotal moment. And after these things, I saw 4 angels standing on the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, held back by powerful celestial beings, preventing them from blowing on the land, the sea, or the trees. Reread that passage, grasping its monumental scope. For mighty angels positioned at the absolute limits of the globe, restraining the very atmospheric forces of nature. This was far more than mere colorful metaphor. It was a staggering preview of the meticulous, supernatural coordination that would orchestrate the final, desperate end-times gathering and rescue of the elect. Why was Andrew so fixated on the necessity of instantaneous flight during that morning's walk? The compassionate fisherman, always attuned to the human element, had been profoundly shaken by Jesus' graphic depiction of the agonizing escape into the Judean mountains. Andrew, the eternally pragmatic one, the brother whose genius lay in connections and logistics rather than grand theory, was already running scenarios. As their path led them winding through the perpetually thronged streets of Jerusalem, Andrew's eyes were magnetically drawn to the most fragile members of the community. The heavily pregnant women navigating the stone paths, the mothers tenderly carrying infants, the aged and infirm whose gait was already painfully slow on level ground. He pictured, in agonizing detail, these susceptible souls attempting a frantic escape through brutal mountain passes during the grip of winter. He envisioned the pregnant women stumbling over sharp, unforgiving terrain, mothers desperately struggling to silence their crying babies while hiding from patrolling soldiers. Picture the sheer terror that was running through Andrew's mind. For Andrew, the urgency was not merely a point of eschatology. It was a deeply felt, intensely personal logistical crisis. When the unmistakable sign manifested, there would be no margin of time to assist those utterly incapable of self-preservation. Meanwhile, James maintained a profound, silent contemplation focused on the immense temple veil. He could feel the imagined texture, the invisible, heavy fabric tearing asunder in his mind's eye. The son of Zebedee, who had always been mesmerized by the sheer, imposing majesty of the temple, now viewed it through a radically new lens. That enormous, multicolored curtain, separating the absolute sanctity of the Holy of Holies from the outer sanctuary, represented more than just rigid religious procedure. It was the physical embodiment of the spiritual chasm between a holy God and fallen humanity, a chasm that Jesus promised would soon be abolished permanently. Think about what this monumental change meant to James. He had been raised under the conviction that only the high priest could venture into God's true presence, and only then for a single day each year, Yom Kippur. The radical concept of that veil being violently ripped was not just a foreshadowing of the temple's physical destruction. It signified the complete, revolutionary transformation of human access to the divine realm. John, gazing upward at the vast blue sky, already visualized the Son of Man descending in glorious clouds, feeling the warmth of the earthly sun as a mere placeholder for future celestial glory. The beloved disciple, always the most spiritually attuned and mystically inclined of the 12, had been utterly captivated by Jesus' breathtaking description of his return. Walking beneath the shimmering Jerusalem dome, he felt he could nearly peer through the azure expanse to the transcendent glory that would one day erupt, a power so overwhelming it would render the sun itself utterly dim by comparison. Andrew, conversely, felt a tightening in his chest, his hand instinctively resting on his own abdomen, haunted by the images of pregnant women fleeing. The practical fisherman could not dislodge the thought of the society's most vulnerable during the impending catastrophe. Every time a nursing mother or expectant woman crossed his path, Jesus' chilling warning echoed, "Woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing infants in those days." Peter, meanwhile, pondered the concept of sheer spiritual perseverance, clenching his closed fist and feeling the tautness of his muscles as a visceral symbol of necessary spiritual endurance. The habitually impulsive fisherman was already steeling his resolve for the trials ahead. He had always favored swift action and dramatic displays, but Jesus' private warnings had cemented a profound lesson. The ultimate victory would not be secured through sudden, flashy acts, but through dogged, patient endurance under unimaginable pressure. They finally entered the densely packed temple courtyard, where the heavy, visceral odor of sacrificial animals assaulted them like a breaking wave, a prophetic echo of the vast affliction to come. The familiar, pungent scent of burning fat, flesh, and exotic incense suddenly acquired a disturbing new significance. Now, this was the existing model of worship, restricted to one physical locale, utterly dependent on the constant flow of animal blood, confined by stringent ceremonial observance. Yet, they now knew this entire massive system was profoundly temporary, irrevocably scheduled for demolition and replacement. Jesus observed the throngs engaged in fervent prayer, knowing with agonizing clarity how many would ultimately be misled, the sharp, acrid incense irritating his perceptive eyes. As he witnessed the sincere, devoted worship of the multitude surrounding him, his heart was weighed down with grief for their impending fate. Many of these genuinely faithful people would be fatally swept away by the convincing false messiahs and the lying wonders he had explicitly warned against. Their very religious commitment and dedication, the bedrock of their lives, would render them tragically susceptible to sophisticated spiritual deception. Think about this profound and tragic irony. The individuals most committed to preserving their ancestral faith would ironically be the ones most likely to embrace a convincing counterfeit. Their desperate eagerness for the long-promised Messiah would make them easy prey for charlatans who perfectly understood what religious jargon to employ and precisely what fabricated signs and portents to exhibit. The disciples positioned themselves closely around him, taking in the daily public instruction, yet their minds remained irrevocably fixed on the severe, private warnings delivered the previous night on the Mount of Olives. Every parable Jesus shared, every inquisitive question posed by the crowd, every tense interaction with the entrenched religious authorities was now processed and filtered through the grim lens of the impending tribulation. They listened dutifully to the public teaching, but their core thoughts were still wrestling with the stunning, world-changing private revelation they had been entrusted with. Mark 13 verse 14 powerfully reinforced the urgency of the instruction they had received. But when ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand. Then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains. The repeated, critical appearance of this warning across multiple gospel accounts emphasized its absolute, life-altering importance. This wasn't just optional spiritual advice. It was critical, life-or-death intelligence concerning their future survival. The day unfolded with the expected public teachings, yet the disciples felt an ever-increasing internal pressure, as if the sands of time were visibly racing toward the prophesied conclusion. Every passing hour felt profoundly weighted with cosmic significance. Every casual conversation seemed potentially laden with prophetic meaning. They found themselves compulsively analyzing all current events, political tensions, religious controversies, societal unrest, through the freshly applied filter of Jesus' stunning prophecies, constantly wondering if each new development might be the true beginning of the end. In the evening, they returned to the safety of the house, collapsing, physically exhausted. The sound of heavy snoring soon merged with the quiet, involuntary murmuring of memorized verses. Sleep proved elusive and difficult after several days of intense prophetic overload. Even in the depths of their dreams, they found themselves mentally rehearsing the warnings, reiterating the signs, and steeling themselves for the tribulation they were promised. The spoken words of Jesus had transcended simple teaching. They had become indispensable survival instructions, indelibly burned into their collective consciousness. Jesus, meanwhile, prayed alone once more, deliberately feeling the roughness of the hard, cold ground beneath his knees, consciously preparing himself for the world-altering events that would definitively seal the prophecies. While his disciples struggled internally with the profound implications of the knowledge they had just received, Jesus remained anchored in unbroken communion with the Father concerning the sequence of events that would fundamentally reshape the entire course of human history. The crushing burden of the foreknowledge of future suffering weighed heavily upon him, yet equally strong was the absolute certainty of ultimate, glorious victory and redemption. The biblical narrative continues its inexorable movement forward, with the disciples now carrying the difficult knowledge like a brightly lit torch held high in the deepening gloom. Jesus' critical words on the Mount of Olives serve as an eternal reminder that genuine vigilance is not about being paralyzed by fear. Rather, it is about living every moment with profound, deliberate purpose. Just as the 12 bore that searing prophetic knowledge like an illuminating torch against the encroaching darkness, we too must steadfastly carry God's enduring truth through our own uncertain times. The very same Jesus who issued those stark warnings about tribulation also guaranteed his definitive promise to gather his elect with resounding trumpets of triumph. In every interim season of expectant waiting, we are simultaneously called to watch keenly, to serve faithfully in our daily lives, and to patiently endure to the very end. What specific element of Jesus' warnings resonated most deeply with you personally? Was it the urgent specificity of the signs, or the profound, unwavering promise of divine rescue? Share your thoughts below. If this crucial message spoke powerfully to your heart today, hit that like button. Subscribe to our channel immediately to stay consistently connected with deep biblical truth, and share this vital content with someone you love who urgently needs encouragement. Click the next video appearing right now on your screen to immediately continue this powerful, illuminating journey through Scripture.